Hello and welcome to an exclusive This Is Jazz interview. My name is Quentin Walston and today I'm sitting down with Pat Bianchi, the Hammond B3 jazz organ master. And more than that, he's also an incredibly knowledgeable historian. So we're going to talk about the history of the jazz organ, key players, key recordings, and much more. So let's dive in right now with this interview. Welcome to a This Is Jazz interview. We've got Pat Bianchi with us, jazz organ master, also historian, band leader, composer, show leader of the organized show on SiriusXM. So thank you for joining us today.
Quentin, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, I want to dive into a lot of organ history. I want to dive into your career as an organist. But before we do that, since we've got some just general jazz fans, I think it's important to kind of bring out the distinctions of the organ. It's an instrument that we recognize the sound of, but I don't think everyone realizes everything that goes into playing it. So can you describe what makes jazz organ unique? We know that there's pedals and poles and all sorts of things. Can you dive into that for us?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's a funny thing. I remember one of my early mentors would say the only thing that's similar between playing organ and piano is the fact that the keys are black and white, which I find to be true the deeper I dive into the instrument because I'm constantly checking out new stuff, whatnot. But one of the big things in terms of playing, well, let's start with playing the instrument in the genre of jazz. As like Jimmy Smith did, McDuff, Jimmy McGriff, Larry Young, they all played their own bass lines, or the majority of the time they played their own bass lines in the left hand. So unlike piano where you're playing voicings and comping and or having a bass player in the rhythm section, organ, you are 2/3 of the rhythm section basically because you cover your bass lines. Yeah. And that's done on the lower keyboard, by the way. And the pedals have an interesting function, kind of depending on what you need them for. Most cases, you tap a pedal. A lot of organists know how to actually play foot bass, but people like Wild Bill Davis and Bill Doggett came up with an idea as if you tap the pedal quick enough, you don't hear a pitch, but it's more like feathering a bass drum. So you hear a thud. And you use that in conjunction with your left hand. That's because the acoustic bass and electric bass have a nice point on their attack. You can hear that center of their note very cleanly and very obviously. But on the organ, it's more of a rounded kind of sound and somewhat ambiguous in a lot of ways, unless you know what you're used to hearing. So by using that pedal and playing quarter notes in unison with your left hand and getting that thud, it helps to bring out the bass line a lot more and help it to be more defined. Of course, you can literally double the bass lines with the foot and the pedal. Of course, you can double the bass lines with the foot and the left hand, and you get a louder bass sound for more accents. Dr. Lonnie Smith would do that all the time. Also, Joey DeFrancesco would do that as well. Also, you can play full-on pedal bass. Barbara Dennerlein, Rhoda Scott, and there's an organist from Buffalo named Bobby Jones that would do that, and comp with their left hand and play foot bass. But majority of people don't do that. And a lot of people chose to play left-hand bass because you could emulate a regular bass a lot more and get a lot of the nuances and kind of the ghost notes and grace notes and things like that you can't do with your foot, but left hand you can do to make it swing harder. So there's that side of the instrument. But then there's the right hand, which either you're comping on the top keyboard or sometimes the bottom keyboard, or you're soloing. And that's one big difference between the piano and the organ is you kind of have to split your brain and you walk bass lines or play bass lines and solo or comp and be able to adjust to what the soloist is doing on the fly. Of course, there's all the drawbars, as you can see behind me, these white and black knobs on the top of the keys where you can pull out different harmonics to get different sounds. So those are the obvious differences. The less obvious differences are the whole idea of dynamics. Since a B3 or a Hammond organ is not touch sensitive, you have to be able to use an expression pedal, which you control with your right foot, to articulate your lines or bring the general level of the instrument up and down. And also you have to use that because the organ is not touch sensitive. No matter how hard you hit the keys, it's going to be the same. You're just doing literally a bunch of on and off switches. So you have to really get creative. And, like I mentioned, Dr. Lonnie Smith and, of course, Joey DeFrancesco were both masters of being able to manipulate that pedal to make the lines that they would play, be like more like horn-like in terms of their dynamics, but then also the overall level of the instrument in terms of volume.
And it's interesting. It's so counterintuitive because I imagine for wind players they just give more wind. For pianists they just push harder. It's got to take some getting used to that your foot makes things louder. I remember once I got to try out an accordion, and that was also a counterintuitive thing because I wasn't used to moving my hands to make sound. I was just used to pushing a button down. So
Yeah.
that's so unique. You brought up the drawbars. For you, was it a lot of just kind of trial and error experimenting, or are there like certain famous settings? Because like I know there's that like squawk sound that you'll sometimes hear. Like,
Mhm.
is it just finding it, or how do you get that?
Well, there's, I guess you could say, quote unquote, stock settings.
Mhm.
The Jimmy Smith sound, for example, which is like the first three drawbars and certain other effects. The bass sound is a specific grouping of drawbars. Usually the first drawbar at eight, next one a four, eight. And then like the sound that you're talking about is like the first drawbar and the last four. So there's like common quote unquote sounds that we all use. But then there's also kind of experimenting. Larry Goldings to me is great with that. He gets some very unique sounds out of the instrument, and he makes them work. In a lot of ways, it's the instrument really is one of the first synthesizers. If you think about it, it's all sine waves. Each drawbar is a sine wave at a different interval and or octave.
Mhm.
And so you combine them. So in a sense, it's like additive synthesis. So you're combining these different harmonics or sine waves to create different unique sounds. So in a lot of ways, you could think about when you're searching for sounds, it's like you're working on an analog synth, kind of figuring out how to work the envelopes and the filters and what oscillators are doing what. It's a similar kind of idea in that
Yeah.
respect.
And I mean, and that idea of it being analog does bring up the fact that it is a historical instrument. So is the Hammond B3 becoming harder and harder to find? Like if someone wants to dive in and learn Hammond, what do they do in that regard?
Well, I mean, the nice thing is with technology having advanced so much, there's a lot of quote unquote clone organs, which are digital facsimiles. There's a number of companies that build them, and like for example, I work with a company called Viscount that does a lot of work with organs in general, and they all model their instruments after the B3 with the drawbars in the same places of B3, all the different switches in the same places. So it's a relatively easy to get one of those. I mean, Nord makes them, Hammond, Suzuki makes them. There's a bunch of companies that do. So if somebody is interested in getting into the instrument, there's a lot of electronic options that don't weigh close to 400 pounds. But there's nothing like the real thing in the same
Yeah.
breath. I mean, you could have a killing set up on main stage of Keyscape with the Rhodes, but sitting down at a well-maintained Fender Rhodes, there's going to be nothing like it. Or you can have a killing physically modeled acoustic piano, but sitting down at a Steinway D, not going to ever be the same. So same thing with the organs. Once you sit down at the real thing, it's like there's nothing like it. But there's a lot of options available, and a lot of people actually, because they're harder to move, and you can find them actually pretty inexpensively or relatively inexpensively on eBay and on Craigslist. I've seen them all over the place. Reverb, you can buy B3s, similar models, A100s, C3s, C2s. There's a lot of organs out there that you can still find if you want the real thing. So there's definitely a lot of options for
That's
sure.
cool. That's cool. Well, let's dive into the history. You've already mentioned some big names, Dr. Lonnie Smith, Joe DeFrancesco. Let's go to the birth of jazz, the birth of organ in jazz. Now, I've heard before that Fats Waller was one of the first. Is that true that Fats was kind of at the beginning of experimenting with organ in jazz?
Yeah, it was. Fats Waller was actually the first. He grew up playing stride piano and actually mentored under James P. Johnson and actually lived with him as a teenager. And so that's where he got to start in music. And he also eventually played theater organ and played for silent movies.
Oh,
And with the advent of Hammond, he kind of switched over that, as at first as a little bit of a novelty, but then he ended up getting really into it. And for example, Jitterbug Waltz is the first recorded Hammond organ I believe, in a jazz context. And also, I think Jitterbug Waltz was the first jazz tune written in 3/4.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's cool.
Yeah, he was actually his son was practicing. I don't believe it was a Bach invention or something like that, and something in hearing his son play that particular invention or whatever a prelude or something it was, kind of inspired him to write Jitterbug Waltz.
That's awesome.
So that's where it kind of started. And he did some. There was some early recordings of him playing with a guitar and percussion, and the quote, somewhat of a jazz organ. What we think about, with organ, guitar, drums that he was doing, as well as doing some spirituals. There's one on YouTube called Go Down. I believe it's called Go Down to Moses. I think I don't remember off the top of my head, but you can Google it. And the first part he's singing was very traditional gospel, spiritual, very classical type organ playing. But then when he goes to the solo, it kind of sounds and swings like a big band of that era almost. It's really interesting to listen to that. So he did really start the whole thing.
That's fascinating. And you brought up the kind of the gospel and spiritual part, and I feel like that's also had a huge influence on jazz organ. I mean, the instrument itself goes back over 1,000 years, I think, in the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, even if you listen to Jimmy Smith, I mean, he has the famous The Sermon album. It seems like there's been a big gospel presence in organ as well. Is that something that you would say is true?
Well, they kind of were a little bit different tracks.
Okay.
Because there's the way I've been able to ascertain in terms of all the research I've done. There was the quote unquote jazz, which really wasn't jazz as we know it, but big band kind of swing style, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
There was the gospels, which kind of started around 1939, I believe. It was in Chicago, which was the first of the gospel, and then pop organ, quote unquote pop, like Ethel Smith as an example, was doing
Okay.
Tico, things like that. And of course, they all converge in different ways throughout the time of the music, because it's all rooted in black music. I mean, all that stuff is rooted in black music. But the thing is like, to me, like Jimmy Smith, when you're getting into that era, quote unquote era, Jimmy Smith, Jack McDuff, they kind of come out of, I mean, of course, growing up in the church, there's those elements, but also Louis Jordan, Louis Jordan? It was, I believe, yeah, Louis Jordan and the Symphony 5 was the group that he had. It was kind of a jump blues swing group from like the 30s and the 40s.
Okay.
And he had both Wild Bill Davis play and Bill Doggett, which is more of like a swinging blues kind of style, and they definitely are drawing out of that a lot. People like Jimmy Smith, things like that, because it was like almost like the popular music in certain respects of that era too.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Fats Waller was an influence. Count Basie was another one that people don't talk about as much, because Count Basie who was coming out of the jazz thing too, studied under Fats, and actually was one of the first to use the organ in the big band setting, and replacing people in the big band because of financial difficulties of keeping a full big band at one point.
Right.
He pared it down and would play organ with a smaller version of the big band. But all these styles are kind of constantly intersecting, because it's all rooted in black music in that respect. But to me, the strong gospel influence of what we think of as gospel organ is something I really feel like I kind of hear more with Jimmy McGriff.
Okay.
And there's a record called A Bag Full of Soul. And if you listen to the second track on there, called DB Blues 1 and 2, the way he's voicing, the way he's using the Leslie, it feels like it's direct out of the church at that point. Whereas Jimmy Smith was, there's definitely those influences. McDuff, there's those influences, but there you can hear more of the quote unquote blues and the jump blues, however you want to say, elements in the music versus literally pulling from the way they were playing. And again, this is just my interpretation of what I've been in terms of research and things I listen to and things like that.
That's
So
amazing. It sounds like there's like kind of, I guess, three big influences. You mentioned the jazz with the Fats Waller, and then the blues bands and the more popular kind of rhythm and blues bands, and then the gospel. So three different tracks kind of converging, and that convergence is what, in the late 50s.
Well, with I would say with all of it, they start happening in the late 50s. McGriff, it kind of comes more in the 60s, things like that. And, you can hear more and more of the gospel elements, especially with McGriff in the 60s, too. Because also the other thing to keep in mind is it wasn't until the mid 50s that there was a Leslie speaker. Was it mid 50s or I'm trying to remember exactly, but the organ came first and then wasn't a Leslie speaker right away. And to me, that's one of the huge parts of how gospel organists play is the way they use the Leslie speaker and just make the whole thing come to life. So that didn't come in right away. It came in a little bit later. So maybe the mid 50s, late 50s, but definitely by the 60s, there was a lot of cross, in terms of the music and the playing styles.
Yeah, because when I think of the Jitterbug Waltz, it doesn't have the Leslie sound. It's just that kind of really clean,
straight sound.
Yeah. Interesting. So when we're looking at the development of organ, by the 50s and 60s, we have Jimmy Smith. I think you mentioned Jack McDuff, and a lot. It's like they all have a unique sound to them, but in general, a lot of the organists are still kind of within that bluesy sound. Like I feel like you don't have as much of the bebop coming out like you would hear later on, or even in like Larry Young's playing. When do we start to see organists that really start branching out and trying out things that are outside of the kind of blues sphere?
Well, it starts in 1956, 57 with Jimmy Smith, because Jimmy's earliest recordings, if you listen live at Small's Paradise, A New Star, New Sound, what's the other one? Live at Club Baby Grand. He's playing in a way that is completely different. Everything is obviously it's single note. It's very staccato. He's playing a lot more vertical, I guess you could say. You could hear him arpeggiating the changes a lot more. He's playing more standards and things like that. So that's really where it starts, because Jimmy was really influenced by people like Bud Powell, Art Tatum, things like that when he came to the organ. So he did it at that point. He was bringing a lot of that stuff with him. The recording Cool Blues is with like him, Lou Donaldson, Tina Brooks on saxophone as well, and Art Blakey, and they're going for it. It's a live set, and it's just like there's stuff you hear there that's incredible, and it's just like by what we consider modern. And also there was a trio that was in existence for a little while, which was Jimmy Smith, John Coltrane, and Charlie Persip on drums, and there was a lot of influence. I think it was on Coltrane's biography where he says that the whole idea of sheets of sound was something he heard Jimmy Smith do early on, and that kind of influenced him in that respect. So it was kind of there that it started. Also, in the late 50s, Shirley Scott, who was another Philadelphia organist, came on the scene, and she was not only an incredible bebop piano player, but when she went to Oregon, she was playing a lot of bebop on the organ, and had a bass player and drums with her, but still all the bebop lines, and still had all the blues and soulful stuff and elements of the church in her playing, but it was very hip and very, very bebop oriented. And in the 60s, there was Don Patterson, who was another Philadelphia. He was originally from Columbus, Ohio, I believe, but he lived in Philadelphia. And he was hardcore Stone Cold bebop all the way. If you go search, you'll hear him playing Charlie Parker tunes. You'll hear him playing, Monk tunes, all that kind of stuff. And he could do all the other stuff. He could play the bluesy stuff, but he had a command of that bebop language that was pretty much second to none. And a lot of those people from the Philadelphia area, a lot of those organists played more like that than anything. The thing that kind of changed, I think, is when Jimmy Smith, after he came out with Organ Grinder Swing, I believe he switched to Verve Records. It was like in the early 60s, 62, and Organ Grinder Swing, which is kind of like a crossover record from playing the jazzy stuff to going to more of the bluesy kind of stuff and more of the groove-oriented stuff. that's when things started to change a little bit more and kind of became part of a certain sound because it was more identifiable with people in the clubs. Not everybody was, even at that time, not everybody was a jazz fan, but if they could hear the blues, they could hear rhythm and blues and a great feel, it's something they could relate to and recognize. And, the people working with Jimmy Smith at that time, in the business aspect, right, I think recognized that along with Jimmy. And so things became a little bit more commercial, when he did I Got My Mojo working, things along those lines, where it was more audience friendly. And a lot of people took to that in terms of other organists were drawn to that kind of thing. Yeah. And that's, I think, where you hear some of those kind of sounds and people come from. Thing would be an example, perfectly actually, Larry Young in his very early years was the record, I believe, is Testifying. Okay. And he's playing. He sounds like Jimmy Smith. Not as fast, but all those the same sounds, same kind of ideas, bluesy kind of stuff. And a lot of people were drawn to that. Obviously Larry Young evolved and went on other things, but John Patton, another example. Gravitating towards the funkier side of things. Early years. Dr. Lonnie Smith, though he could burn and play the other stuff, you could hear when we hear Alligator Boogaloo and all those early Lou Donaldson recordings. Yeah, it's a lot of that kind of sound that Jimmy Smith went to later on, for sure.
Yeah, man, that's fascinating. And there's so many little side roads I want to go on, but I know we gotta keep trucking on. So you brought up, well, I do want to cover because my big introduction to Larry Young, I went over to my college professor's listening room, and he has just crazy audio file, and he puts on Larry Young's Unity. And I was like 20 or something. That was the first time I heard it, and just blew my mind. That kind of modal approach. So was Larry Young unique in that, or is that just kind of what organists were gravitating to as the 60s unfurled into the 70s and so on? Or
well, I think Larry Young was unique to it. He wasn't the first. Actually, Jimmy was the first, Jimmy Smith. There's some recordings where he did movie soundtracks, and some other rare recordings I remember getting from Joey DeFrancesco. He pointed this out to me. You could hear that kind of fourths, those intervallic kind of things. I mean, though Jimmy didn't really follow into, really make a, I don't want to say he didn't develop a vocabulary as deep as Larry Young did. He was doing it earlier for sure, and I think Larry might have even heard that. But up until the point, 66, 67, when Unity was recorded, there was nobody that had played like that. And Larry Young really set a trend that way. In terms of, like I said, the intervallic playing of force, using pentatonics. People would say he was the John Coltrane of organ. I always felt like it was more McCoy Tyner-like.
Right.
Excuse me.
Pedal points and stuff.
Just using those kind of structures and using the pentatonics so much. But yeah, Larry Young was very unique in that. And I think taking the instrument, quote unquote, out, because if you listen to the next record, Contrasts, that came out in about a year after Unity, you could hear as a composer and in terms of the concept of playing, he was going further into more exploratory areas, and by the time he's, with the Tony Williams Lifetime thing, he's just doing all sorts of stuff, but he was always kind of pushing the envelope for where the organ could go. I mean, I guess, it's like a natural progression for a musician of that level of ability, just to see how far you could push it and be creative with it.
Another incredible creative person I had the pleasure to see live was Dr. Lonnie Smith. And just the way that his compositions and his arrangements, like he did this on one of his records, I can't remember what it was, but he did Straight No Chaser, and it was like this crazy chord that was like planing, and it wasn't Straight No Chaser. It was something completely new. And Lonnie Smith mentored you, is that right?
He was one of the people, he was always very supportive. Through the years, he gave me a lot of advice. He actually got me onto Lou Donaldson's gig when he couldn't make it. So then I started subbing before I joined Lou's band. But Lonnie, I mean, his I think it's taken a long time for people to realize how important he's been to the music. Not only to Oregon, but the music in general, because his creativity, like you're saying, that's the first thing, the creativity. I think the way and also how you kind of paraphrase how he sculpts and molds tunes, and he's not playing, Jimmy Smith speed or Joey's kind of runs, but what he does and the way he draws everybody, musician or not, into the music. And I think that's just in of itself is such a special thing that any average person off the street, if they saw him play, they would be kind of just like mesmerized by what he does. And he really just pulls people in, the amount of emotion that he brings. But then also the kind of like at times like the childlike kind of thing where it's like he's like a little kid playing a toy and he's just having a ball and he's like, what can this do, what can this do, what can that do? And I think that grabs at people in a certain respect, that just playing, it's like, yeah, I can play Coltrane changes, big deal. The average person is not going to care, but it's like, but what he's doing, and as a result, the music that comes out of it, and especially the dynamics. I mean, from a whisper to a roar, and it all makes perfect sense. And it's like that in of itself is special. And and the other thing that Lonnie had that I thought was a real innovation that people don't mention as much is we were talking about the bass pedals at the beginning of the interview. Mm-hmm. And Lonnie had a certain way, because he played a lot of groove tunes too and funk and just play killing pocket stuff. And he would use the pedals in a certain way where he would double certain notes, almost double certain notes, play this on the pedal, do this in combination with his left hand, that made the bass lines come alive like a lot of organ players had never really done, that I have heard do before. Yeah. And it felt more like literally another person in the band, or literally a bass player, because the way he manipulated those lines and made the bass come to life beyond just a walking or like a bossa pattern for like a boogaloo or something. He had all these things he would do. So I think that's another innovation that he came up with, and he really developed.
I think, that creativity, and I love the way you described like how he's just kind of exploring the instrument. I can't remember if I read it somewhere, and I guess you can confirm. Maybe was he self-taught? Or did he, or like he couldn't read music or something?
He was. I think he. Well, I think he was to a degree self-taught. I mean, he was raised in a musical family, and his mother introduced him to classical, gospel, jazz, all the things like that. And he was actually also a singer. He was. I was actually reading this the other night, an article or something, and he was a vocalist first, I think, and he sang in a band, and he was around from the Buffalo, New York area, and Grover Washington Jr. was one of the other vocalists in that band at the time, so they kind of came up with that in that way. But I mean, I imagine he played piano. And, I think it was, he might have saw Jimmy Smith or something, and that kind of got the gears turning. And then there was a person in Buffalo who owned a music store named Art Kubera, I believe it was. And, he saw that Dr. Lonnie Smith was really interested, and he told them, if you can get this organ out of this music store on your own, it's yours. And he figured out how to do it. He got it back to his place, and, he just kind of, I guess, taught himself in a lot of ways, or worked on it, and eventually, moved to New York and started playing with George Benson in the Cookbook Band, and meeting Lou and traveling and playing with all sorts of people throughout the years. Wow. So,
yeah, that's fascinating. I asked because sometimes it seems that some musicians that are self-taught have a different kind of creativity. Like Duke Ellington was self-taught, and Errol Garner was self-taught, and it's like they're both wildly creative. And I didn't know if there's maybe a connection, like because you don't know what rules are supposed to be there, you might find yourself thinking out of the box in different ways. So it was just an aside thought, but let's talk about one other organist, and then I want to talk about your music. You mentioned Joey DeFrancesco, and he also had the organized show, I believe. And so he, like you, I believe, did a lot to both preserve the history but also move the music forward. So what was your relationship with Joey, and any insights that you have about his music and playing?
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate that when I was in college, I got to meet, I got to, indirectly meet Joey. The way the story goes is I was in my senior year at school, and I had a Hammond organ at home, an M100, which had the foot bass. You couldn't play left-hand bass on it. And I was around a lot of people at that time that were like, yeah, to be a real organist, you got to play all bass with your feet. So I kind of was of that mentality. And there was a users group or an internet forum mailing list at that time called Hammond Organ Users. And it would talk about playing technique, history, all that kind of stuff. And one day a conversation thread starts about Jack McDuff literally talking about playing left-hand bass and the way he would tap the pedals to get a certain sound. So, being an arrogant college kid, I kind of chimed in and said, nah, you don't do that. You got to play actual foot bass. And this whole argument kind of started between me and somebody called the Authority on this group. Mind you, it's worldwide. Everybody's reading it. And we just go back and forth until a mutual friend of mine, of ours, calls me up and he goes, do you realize who you're talking to on this internet forum? And it's like, nah, he won't even identify who he is. Why should I even care? And he goes, well, you've been arguing with Joey DeFrancesco all week. So I was like 19, 20, something like that when that happened. And so I immediately got on because, Live at the 5 spot had already come out, and that was a record I loved. It was probably one of the reasons for me continuing and wanting to pursue Oregon further. I get it. So I email, man, I apologize. I didn't realize it was you, and again, I'm so sorry. And then 10 minutes later, I get an email response with a phone number, and that was it, So I was nervous. So I was like, all right, I just got to call it up. So I called it up, and and I was like, hello, and he's like, hello, and yeah, this is Pat Bianchi calling. He goes, oh yeah, man, how's that left foot doing? The first thing, just to give me a hard time with that. But and then so that was probably 1997, and so I had known him for I was fortunate to know him for a very long time and work with him on a couple occasions and be mentored, by him over the years. And I mean, he kind of was at the head of the resurgence of the instrument, and I think he set a new bar in a lot of ways. His musical ability was superhuman. It was one of the most naturally gifted people I ever could see, or ever heard too. And of course, that was an inspiration for me. And instead of feeling like, oh, I'll never get there, it inspired me to figure out ways to try to get my game up, I guess, and figure out, well, how does this work, or how does he do this, or and just work at it. And it's been a never-ending thing. So he's, very, very, very important, the legacy, and of course he knew all the cats, the organs of the previous generations that people were talking about. So it was a direct link to a lot of that music and to those people. And his impact, I think, on music and on organ, the Hammond organ, will be felt forever. For sure.
That's great. I love that story. You never know who's behind that username.
You just never know. Well, you never know who you're talking to in general.
Yeah, man, that's great. Well, let's talk about your music. So I didn't realize, it sounds like you took up organ a little bit later. Was piano your primary instrument before that?
No, I actually started on an organ first, but I was a farfisa organ of all things, because I come from a family of musicians. My father's a drummer. Both grandfathers were horn players. And in Rochester, New York, in those earlier years, dance band music was really big. And by dance band, it was like big band pared down to like a small group format. And so my father would record the gigs that he would play on the weekends, and we would sit and listen to them. And I, expressed interest, I guess, in what I thought was an organ in the band. But it was actually what's called a quarterbox, which is an accordion with organ electronics in it. So, but they saw that I was interested in the music and in all that kind of stuff. So for my 7th Christmas, I was 7 years old for Christmas, I got a farfisa organ from one grandfather, and the other grandfather gave me an amplifier to go with it. So I would spend just hours in the basement learning how to play all these big band standards on organ, playing bass and all that kind of stuff, and eventually doing jam sessions with my grandfathers and my dad in their basement. And then by the time I think it was 12 or 13, I was starting to do some of these gigs with them at like Elks clubs and things like that and private events. So, and I, by the time I was maybe 10 or 11, I started classical piano lessons, and it didn't take to it obviously as well. I didn't have the same kind of passion as I did for the other stuff. But in high school, I had a band director who was a great jazz pianist. So that's kind of in high school where I got the thing of, learning left-hand voicings and kind of getting into the whole thing then. But it was actually organ first and then switching later and then going back to organ.
That's awesome. And man, learning standards at that young age, I'm sure just opened up your ears and just put all that language in you. Like that's awesome. So
I'm grateful for those experiences.
Yeah. Oh man. You've obviously then you've played, you have a big discography. You've played in a bunch of different groups and different lineups. I mean, an organ trio can have a guitar often as a accompanying instrument. It can also have a saxophone. Is there, well, I don't want to say is there a preference, because I mean, I'm sure you have a group now and you're obviously playing with who you prefer, but how do you find that you have to change your sound based on the lineup, or is it just kind of more based on the person, or how do you reconcile with different kind of organ lineups?
I think it has to do less with the lineups and more with the players themselves. Like at one point, I was doing a quartet project with guitarist Paul Bollenbeck and drummer Byron Landham and vibraphonist Joe Locke. And so there's 3 accompanying instruments in the same band, so it's, so you just, everybody figures out how to make it work, and you adjust your thing. Yeah. But then when I was playing with Pat Martino, I would play different, because that situation required a different approach versus Lou Donaldson. So I think it really is more about the musicians, and you adapt to that versus the instrumentation for the most part. Generally, at least for me, generally speaking.
Very cool.
Because I'll play I love tenor organ drums trio. And it's what I'm doing a project with that at the moment. And there'll be a lot of times when even the tenor player, I'll just play bass. I won't even comp that much, because it's just, it works for the music, So whereas I'll play with some guitar players and I have to comp more. So it just depends on the situation of the musicians and where they're kind of going too.
So as musicians, we're always growing. We're always finding inspiration. Is there anything that's a sound that you're after right now? Is there anything that you're reaching for in your own playing?
I think it's always a thing, number one, of hand independence, constantly pulling those hands further apart. Because you're dealing with harmonic vocabulary and rhythmic vocabulary at the same time. So keeping those kinds of things, such as developing a further independence. But also, I think there's a difference in playing, for example, Lazy Bird versus playing Anna Maria, harmonically speaking. And it's like, so learning how to, constantly working on playing lines or figuring out ways to play lines that I don't need to have a guitar player or accompanying instrument in order for it to sound like I'm playing the changes, So it's just further, I don't know if it's further studies in harmony or just looking at different ways to play lines. And for certain kinds of compositions, Humpty Dumpty, when I was working on that tune, that was one of those things that's kind of like that, where it's like, I want to be able to feel like I can play the changes or play a melody over the changes and not have to have a guitar player play, E flat, D major, G flat, F, and just push those constantly. So. Yeah. Those are big things for me these days.
Where can we find you? Your tour, your website? Where do we find Pat Bianchi?
Yeah, you can go to Instagram, Pat Bianchi Official. My website is www.patbianchi.com. Facebook, Pat Bianchi Official. Or just Google me. I'm around.
A huge thank you to Pat Bianchi for sitting down with me for this interview, and thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about jazz, whether it's the history, the theory, how to teach it, and more, you can check that out at our website, thisisjazz.com. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next interview.